They say that some families carry secrets so dark they are buried beneath the soil of their own history, hidden behind polite smiles and old photographs. But what happens when those secrets are not just whispered rumors, but living, breathing truths? Truths so twisted that they challenge the very foundation of what we consider human. This is the story of a man whose life was a warning written in flesh and blood, whose family tree resembled less a map of generations and more a warning etched in twisted lines. His wife was not just his companion, not just the mother of his children, but both his sister and his cousin. And while the world around them moved in ordinary, predictable patterns, their lives unfolded in shadows, where love and blood intertwined in ways most could never imagine. The man was born in a small, almost invisible town, a place so secluded it seemed to exist outside of time. Its streets were dusty, its houses weathered by decades of neglect, and its families so tightly interwoven that outsiders rarely stayed long enough to notice the patterns. Within this closed loop, he grew up knowing only the contours of his own bloodline, learning early that the world outside was irrelevant compared to the imperatives of his own family. To the children of this town, relationships were less about choice and more about inheritance, of property, of tradition, and of a strange, almost sacred lineage that demanded preservation at any cost. From a young age, the signs were subtle. He noticed that his parents spoke in riddles, that his mother's eyes lingered too long when she looked at him, that cousins became playmates, then confidants, then something more ambiguous, something unspoken. No one talked about it. No one needed to. In this world, the boundaries we consider natural were not just blurred, they were erased. By the time he reached adulthood, the town's silence had conditioned him, had taught him that love was not limited to strangers, that loyalty was measured in shared blood, and that the rules the rest of the world followed did not apply here. What followed next would shock anyone who stumbled across the story today. His marriage was not an accident. It was a calculated continuation of a cycle that had repeated for generations, a decision made to keep the family line intact, to double down on the genetics that had been isolated for decades. To the outside world, he was just another man with a wife, another family raising children quietly in a remote town. But the reality beneath the surface was far darker. Their home was not simply a house, it was a crucible, where the boundaries between love, obsession, and taboo melted away. Every smile, every handshake, every family gathering carried a weight that no visitor could comprehend, a quiet horror that permeated every corner of their lives. The implications of such unions are not just social, not just moral, they are biological, psychological, and generational. In this family, the sins of the past were written on the faces of the children, in their strange features, in their stunted growth, and in the invisible burdens they carried. And yet, the town looked away, as towns often do when confronted with truths too uncomfortable to face. This story is about more than one man, one wife, one family. It is a window into the hidden corners of American life, where isolation breeds extremes, and where history can repeat itself in ways that feel almost mythic, almost inevitable. By the time he reached his 20s, the man's world had narrowed into an unbroken circle of relatives and neighbors who had known each other for generations. Outsiders were rare, and when they appeared, they were met with suspicion, their presence quickly absorbed or discarded. Within this closed society, marriages like his were not scandalous, they were practical. His union with his sister, who was also his cousin, was seen less as a violation and more as the logical preservation of the bloodline. To them, the outside world's rules were irrelevant. What mattered was continuity, survival, and the unspoken covenant of shared ancestry. Their courtship, if it could even be called that, was quiet and almost ceremonial. There was no drama, no protests, no declarations of forbidden love. Instead, there was a natural inevitability to it, as if the universe itself had conspired to place them together. Their parents watched silently, offering subtle guidance, small nudges in the right direction, never a word of caution, because they knew the importance of maintaining the lineage. In their eyes, family loyalty outweighed morality. Love, in this context, was measured by blood, by the preservation of traits, and by the silent vow that their children would carry on the same pattern. The children of this marriage were born into a world heavy with expectation. From the moment of birth, they were not just children. They were symbols, living proof of a family's determination to remain insular. Their growth was monitored obsessively. Every birth defect, every quirk of behavior, every unusual feature was catalogued and noted, not as a tragedy, but as a scientific observation. In the quiet corners of the home, where ordinary families might have shared bedtime stories, these children inherited lessons about secrecy, survival, and the strange, unspoken rules that governed the adults around them. Even beyond the family, the town itself seemed complicit. Neighbors whispered, perhaps, but rarely intervened. Perhaps they were bound by fear, by familiarity, or by their own adherence to similar cycles. In such towns, silence becomes a form of protection, a way to preserve the fragile social fabric, even if that fabric is warped. The man's life, though seemingly ordinary from a distance, was therefore steeped in ritual and observation. Every choice he made, every word he spoke, was guided by an invisible set of rules passed down through generations, rules designed to keep the bloodline pure, isolated, and unchallenged. What made his story particularly haunting is not merely the incestuous nature of his marriage, but the way in which it normalized itself. There were no public scandals, no explosive confrontations, only a quiet, relentless adherence to a family code that had existed long before him and would continue long after. In this isolated pocket of the country, the ordinary concept of morality did not apply. What outsiders might consider horrific, the family considered necessary, inevitable, and even virtuous. And so, the seeds of the next generation were planted, carrying the weight of generations' worth of secrets, sins, and blood. The children born of a union that most would consider unnatural carried the unmistakable marks of generations pressed too closely together. Their features were a testament to isolation: wide-set eyes, thin limbs, unusual facial structures, subtle asymmetries that spoke of a lineage constrained by repetition. But beyond the physical, there was something far more insidious at work. They inherited not just DNA, but patterns of behavior, instincts, and a worldview shaped by the unusual family code that governed their home. To outsiders, they might appear awkward, fragile, or odd. To those who knew the truth, they were living symbols of a history that refused to die. The man's own psyche had been shaped by this cycle long before he married. From childhood, he had learned that boundaries existed only in stories, in the world outside, in towns he would never truly belong to. Within the walls of his family home, love and blood were interchangeable. Discipline and affection came from the same hand. Loyalty was measured in silent compliance, in the quiet acceptance of rules no one explained. By the time he chose his wife, he had internalized a logic that seemed alien to anyone else. Continuity above all else, family above morality, preservation above consequence. Even the town's environment seemed to conspire with the family's isolation. Generations of inbreeding had been quietly tolerated because outsiders rarely ventured into these hidden hollows of the Appalachian backcountry. The land itself acted as a barrier: thick forests, winding roads, and a geography designed to keep the outside world at bay. Within this natural fortress, the family's secrets festered, accumulating layers over decades. Each generation repeated the mistakes, or rituals, of the last, unaware or uncaring of the ripple effects, until the present became almost indistinguishable from the past. In the home, the children grew up in a rhythm that was both ordinary and grotesque. Meals were shared, chores were assigned, and yet beneath the surface, everything carried a weight. Conversations hinted at histories too uncomfortable to name. Photographs captured more than smiles. They recorded genetics, inherited deformities, and a subtle, almost imperceptible tension. The family lived in the quiet knowledge that the outside world would never fully understand them, and perhaps that was a comfort. Isolation, after all, provides safety, and in the dark, twisted corners of this lineage, safety was everything. And yet, there was a creeping awareness, an unease that even the adults could not escape. With each generation, the consequences of repeated bloodlines became impossible to ignore. Children were weaker, illnesses more frequent, behaviors more erratic. The quiet inevitability of what had been set in motion was becoming impossible to ignore. What had begun as a calculated decision to preserve the family line had grown into a psychological and biological trap, a cycle that promised to consume anyone who dared to follow it. The question was no longer whether it would continue, but how far it could go before the entire lineage collapsed under the weight of its own secrets. By the time the man and his wife began raising their own children, the weight of history had become nearly unbearable. Every action was informed by the generations that had come before, every decision a repetition of a pattern set long ago. In many families, children are born into freedom, into a world of possibility. In this household, the children were born into expectation shaped not by dreams, but by the rigid, unyielding logic of bloodlines. Their very existence was a testament to a lineage determined to survive at any cost, and every day was a rehearsal of the rules that had governed the family for decades. The household was quiet, but not peaceful. There was an omnipresent tension, a subtle unease that hung over the family like fog over the mountains surrounding their isolated town. Every interaction carried a double meaning. A word of praise could conceal a warning. A gesture of affection could reinforce unspoken rules. The children grew up learning that love and obligation were inseparable, that rebellion was not just dangerous, it was unthinkable. And through it all, the parents maintained an eerie calm, the kind that comes from absolute conviction that what they are doing is necessary, even righteous. Visitors, when they did arrive, could sense something off immediately. The family appeared normal enough on the surface, polite, cordial, even welcoming. Yet beneath the smiles and the handshakes was a subtle rigidity, a precision of behavior honed over generations of isolation. Outsiders might have felt the weight without understanding why, like walking through a house where every photograph, every object, every smile carries a secret too heavy to bear. Few stayed long, and fewer still returned. And the family, for its part, rarely invited interference. Their history, their logic, and their choices were theirs alone. Yet, despite the insularity, cracks began to show. The effects of repeated bloodlines manifested in ways that could no longer be ignored. Children were more susceptible to illness, more prone to mental instability, and carried physical traits that betrayed generations of concentrated genetics. The parents themselves were forced to confront the consequences of their choices, though they did so quietly, never allowing the outside world a glimpse of the reality within. To them, the line between love and responsibility had always been blurred, and now the boundaries were breaking entirely. It was in these quiet moments, in the unseen corners of the home, that the horror of their situation was most palpable, not in dramatic confrontations or shocking events, but in the relentless, grinding reality of a family trapped in its own design. Every meal, every bedtime story, every whispered instruction reinforced the cycle, shaping the next generation into its mirror image. And as the years went by, the realization became unavoidable. The family was not just isolated, not just secretive, it was living proof of the consequences when love, loyalty, and blood intertwined too closely, too often, and for too long. As the children grew, the full weight of their inheritance became impossible to ignore. Their physical differences were subtle but undeniable, their behaviors tinged with the residue of generations confined to the same circle. Where other children might have experienced freedom or exploration, they inherited a world constrained by invisible boundaries. Each step they took, each choice they made, was guided by a system so old, so entrenched, that it seemed less like upbringing and more like genetic destiny. Their family's logic was clear: survival through repetition, continuity at all costs. The cost, however, was only now becoming visible in every aspect of their lives. It is here, in this tense middle ground, that the story grows even darker. While the world outside moved forward, progressing, evolving, learning from its mistakes, The family remained frozen, repeating the same patterns with unwavering conviction. The children, caught between instinct and instruction, became mirrors of the past. Their minds, their bodies, and their futures were shaped by choices made decades before they were born. And yet, in the quiet moments, a subtle awareness flickered. Some of the older children sensed the abnormality of their situation, understood that what surrounded them was not ordinary, but were trapped by the very blood that bound them to it. It is at this point that we ask ourselves, what would any of us do in such a lineage? How would we act if the very people we trusted most were also the architects of our limitations? If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The question lingers not just for those who lived it, but for us, peering through time into the hidden corners of a family history most would rather forget. The town continued to turn a blind eye. Silence, after all, is a convenient ally. People whispered, rumors circulated, but no intervention came. Even as the signs of inbreeding became obvious, the isolation of the town provided both cover and complicity. The family's choices were tolerated, implicitly if not explicitly, because the pattern was ingrained into the fabric of the community. Outsiders may have called it horror, but insiders understood it as survival. In this warped logic, morality was defined not by the wider world, but by the preservation of the line and the avoidance of outsiders' interference. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the story. Horror does not always arrive in dramatic bursts. Sometimes it seeps in, slow, insidious, almost normal in its quiet accumulation. And in this family, generation after generation was molded by that quiet horror. Love, loyalty, and blood intertwined in ways that were inseparable, and the consequences, physical, psychological, and moral, were unavoidable. By understanding their story, we glimpse a reflection of what isolation and repetition can do when left unchecked, when the rules of society no longer apply, and when survival is measured in blood rather than choice. By now, the full weight of the family's choices had begun to manifest in the most chilling ways. The children, now adults themselves, carried forward not just the legacy of repeated bloodlines, but the behavioral patterns ingrained over decades. Their relationships, their thinking, even their understanding of love and loyalty were shaped by an almost invisible framework that had been laid before they were born. The outside world would have called it grotesque, abnormal, even monstrous. But within the family it was ordinary, inevitable, a continuation of a cycle that demanded repetition to survive. The parents, too, were not untouched by the consequences. Over the years they had watched as the subtle distortions of repeated lineage grew clearer, impossible to deny. Some children were frail, others psychologically burdened, traits amplified by the concentration of genetics that the family had so fiercely preserved. Yet even as these consequences became visible, the parents could not, or would not, break the pattern. To do so would be to betray a history that had dictated every action, every choice, every heartbeat for generations. And so they carried on, silent, determined, unwavering in their commitment to a cycle that seemed increasingly doomed, yet somehow unstoppable. Even beyond the family, the town's complicity remained steadfast. Outsiders were rare, and rumors were easily dismissed or deflected. In this isolated enclave, moral boundaries were flexible, and the notion of intervention almost unthinkable. Silence became both shield and accomplice. The community tolerated what they might have condemned elsewhere, understanding perhaps on some subconscious level that interference was futile. In a place so insular, so bound by history and blood, the story of this family could remain hidden, invisible, except for the occasional passerby who glimpsed the subtle, undeniable marks of isolation and inbreeding etched into the faces of its members. What makes this lineage so haunting is not simply the repetition of bloodlines, but the quiet inevitability of its continuation. Each generation reinforced the last, creating a cycle that seemed almost immune to reason or consequence. Children became adults, adults became parents, and the same patterns, love, loyalty, secrecy, reproduced themselves with uncanny precision. The family home, the town, even the surrounding landscape became instruments in this cycle, shaping lives in ways both visible and hidden. And as history continued its quiet, relentless march, the family itself became both observer and victim of its own legacy. The horror lies not in spectacle, but in persistence. It is not a story of sudden tragedy, but of a slow, inexorable erosion of what most of us take for granted: normalcy, choice, and freedom from the weight of inherited sins. By the time the outside world would have noticed, generations had already been shaped, molded, and trapped by a cycle that refused to yield. And so, what began as a marriage, one considered practical, even virtuous within its context, became a living testament to the dangers of isolation, obsession, and the human impulse to preserve blood above all else. As the latest generation reached adulthood, the full scope of the family's history became undeniable. Faces, behaviors, and even instincts carried the echo of generations pressed too closely together. It was impossible to see them and not sense the weight of every decision, every marriage, every choice that had brought them to this point. And yet, the family carried on as though it were normal, as though the world outside could never touch them. In this quiet persistence lies the deepest horror, the slow, unrelenting accumulation of consequences, generation after generation, until normalcy becomes impossible to define. The man, once a child of the same isolated town, now stood at the center of a lineage that had long since ceased to follow the rules of ordinary families. His marriage, a union with his sister and cousin, was no longer an aberration. It was a defining feature of the family's history. He watched his children, his nieces and nephews, and saw in them the same patterns that had shaped him: loyalty intertwined with blood, love inseparable from duty, and morality subordinated to preservation. The world outside could never understand it, could never intervene, and perhaps that was the point. Isolation had become both prison and protector, shaping lives in ways both subtle and devastating. In a sense, the story is not just about this man or his wife or their children. It is about what happens when humans remove themselves from the checks and balances of society, when tradition, blood, and survival are elevated above empathy, reason, and choice. In this small, hidden town, history repeats itself silently, inexorably. The family becomes a living archive of human obsession, genetic consequence, and the dark paths that are possible when secrecy and isolation dominate life. Every face, every behavior, every quiet glance carries the imprint of generations, a reminder of what can happen when nature is manipulated by desire and necessity. Yet even in the shadows there is a strange resilience. Life continues stubbornly, despite the consequences. Children are born, families endure, and the town persists, quietly observing, quietly protecting, silently complicit. The horror, then, is not just in what has happened, but in its persistence. It is in the knowledge that these patterns could continue indefinitely, hidden in the mountains, in the forests, in the towns we seldom notice. The story is a warning, a mirror reflecting the darkest possibilities when love, loyalty, and blood become indistinguishable from obsession. In the end, the man, his wife, and their descendants exist as both history and living proof, a testament to choices made in isolation and the quiet, relentless consequences of preserving blood above all else. Their story is not sensationalized, it is not exaggerated. It is the raw, unvarnished truth of a lineage hidden in plain sight, and it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How far would we go for family? What secrets lie beneath the surface of the places we call home? And when morality conflicts with survival, which will we choose? In the shadows of this forgotten town, the answers are written not in books, but in faces, in blood, and in the silence that surrounds them.